My daughter-in-law left for a week of mental health recovery. The moment the heavy oak front door slammed shut, my son, who had been confined to a wheelchair for 5 years, slowly pushed himself up, walked into the kitchen, and told me we needed to leave immediately. I dropped my coffee mug, the porcelain shattering across the hardwood floor. Before I tell you what we found at the harbor and how we dismantled her entire life, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe the truth always comes to light, and that true justice is a dish best served cold. I am Alan, 65 years old, and for the past 5 years, I have lived as a ghost inside the walls of my own home. My house is a sprawling colonial-style property sitting on 2 acres of dense pine trees. I bought this house 30 years ago. I paid the mortgage with 30 years of calluses and overtime. Today, however, my name is essentially meaningless here. I reside in the smallest guest room on the ground floor, a room that used to hold winter coats and old holiday decorations. Now it holds a single twin bed, a plastic dresser, and the lingering scent of rubbing alcohol. I was relegated to this space by Vanessa, my daughter-in-law supposedly, so I could be closer to the kitchen to attend to her husband. Her husband is my son, Colin. 5 years ago, a devastating highway pileup shattered his spine. The doctors told us he would never walk again. From that day forward, Vanessa took absolute control. She legally secured medical power of attorney and a strict guardianship order. She took over Colin's finances, which included a highly lucrative series of tech patent royalties he had developed in his 20s. I moved in to help my son, assuming we would tackle the tragedy as a family. Instead, I became an unpaid, indentured servant. Vanessa established a regime of complete humiliation. She controlled the grocery budget, the thermostat, and my daily schedule. Every morning I woke up at 5 to bathe Colin, change his clothes, and prepare his specialized meals. Vanessa slept until 9. She would descend the mahogany staircase dressed in pristine athletic wear, inspect my work, and inevitably find something wrong. She would run a manicured finger over the kitchen counter and loudly complain about my incompetence. She told me repeatedly that I only had a roof over my head because of her profound generosity. She reminded me that assisted living facilities were expensive and that I should be grateful she allowed me to stay in what she boldly referred to as her house. I swallowed my pride every single day. I kept my mouth shut and my head down because I loved my son. Colin was always groggy, his eyes unfocused, his head slumped to the side. He could barely string 2 sentences together. I thought it was the depression of losing his mobility. I thought his spirit was simply broken. I spent my days reading to him, feeding him, and enduring Vanessa's relentless, calculated cruelty. The illusion finally began to crack last Tuesday. Vanessa came into the living room dragging a massive designer suitcase across the Persian rug. She wore a silk blouse and oversized sunglasses. She announced she had reached her absolute limit with the depressing atmosphere of the house and was leaving for a 7-day mental health retreat in Sedona. She claimed she needed the desert air to recover from the sheer exhaustion of being a caregiver, a role she had never actually performed for a single hour. She handed me a tightly typed list of chores. The list demanded I scrub the grout in all 4 bathrooms, reseed the back lawn, and manage Colin's rigorous medication schedule exactly to the minute. She looked at me with absolute contempt, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She told me not to burn the house down and to keep Colin out of the front windows because the neighbors were tired of looking at a depressing situation. She did not say goodbye to her husband. She simply turned around, walked out the front door, and pulled it shut. The heavy oak door slammed with a loud final thud. The lock clicked. Her luxury SUV engine roared to life in the driveway and faded down the street. I stood in the sudden silence of the house. I let out a long, exhausted breath and walked into the kitchen to pour myself a cup of black coffee. I stood by the marble island staring out the window at the empty driveway. Behind me, the distinct squeak of rubber wheelchair tires rolled over the hardwood. I assumed Colin had woken up early and needed his morning medication. I turned around, holding my warm ceramic mug. Colin was not slumped over. His hands were tightly gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. His knuckles were completely white. I watched in absolute paralysis as my son planted his bare feet on the floor. His legs shook violently. The muscles trembled under his sweatpants. With a sharp gasp of pain, Colin pushed his entire body upward. He locked his knees. He stood up. He was swaying, breathing heavily, but he was standing perfectly upright. He looked directly into my eyes. His gaze was sharper and clearer than I had seen it in 5 years. He took one unsteady step forward, then another. He leaned against the kitchen counter, looked at my horrified face, and spoke in a clear, urgent whisper. He said we needed to go to the harbor right now. My fingers lost all their strength. The coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered against the floor, splashing dark liquid across the pristine wood. I fell to my knees, not caring about the broken porcelain. I reached out to touch his legs, convinced I was experiencing a psychotic break. I demanded to know how this was possible. I demanded to know how long he could walk. Colin sank into a dining chair, wiping sweat from his forehead. He spoke rapidly, his voice filled with a cold, terrifying clarity. He told me he had not been paralyzed for the last 2 years. The initial injury was severe, but his spinal cord had partially healed. He had regained feeling in his legs 24 months ago. But he never had the chance to show me because Vanessa had realized his recovery meant she would lose her absolute legal control over his estate. Colin explained that Vanessa had been secretly grinding massive doses of heavy sedatives and illegal muscle relaxants into his daily meals. She kept him in a chemically induced vegetative state. She trapped him in his own mind. He was completely aware of his surroundings, but physically incapable of speaking or fighting back due to the heavy narcotics coursing through his blood. He explained that she handled all the food preparation for his specific diet, forbidding me from making his meals under the guise of dietary restrictions. He said that the moment she left for her trip, the morning dose was missed, and the fog began to clear just enough for him to force his muscles to respond. My chest tightened with a rage so violent I could barely breathe. I wanted to call the police immediately. I reached for the landline phone on the wall. Colin grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. He shook his head. He laid out the brutal, undeniable truth of our situation. Vanessa held a bulletproof medical power of attorney. She had a court-ordered guardianship. If we called the authorities right now, she would rush back, show them the extensive legal paperwork, and claim Colin was experiencing a violent psychiatric episode. She would tell the police that his claims of being drugged were paranoid delusions. She would have him permanently committed to a locked psychiatric facility by the end of the day, and I would be arrested for interfering with his medical care. We had no physical proof of the poison. We only had his word against a mountain of legal documents she had carefully curated over 5 years. We were trapped in a legal cage she had built around us. Colin pointed up at the ceiling corners. Small black domes were mounted above the cabinets. Vanessa had installed interior security cameras 6 months ago, claiming it was for Colin's safety. Colin told me the cameras did not record audio, but she checked the live video feeds constantly from her phone. We had only minutes before she logged in from the airport to check on us. If she saw him standing, the game was entirely over. He told me she was not going to Sedona. He had overheard her talking on her cell phone late at night, while she assumed he was unconscious. She was heading to the municipal harbor. She was finalizing a massive financial transfer to steal his tech patents and the equity of my house. She was preparing to vanish. We had to move immediately. We had to find out exactly what boat she was getting on and who she was meeting. I swept the broken mug under the counter with my foot. I helped my son back into his wheelchair. I wheeled him toward the garage, keeping his head slumped forward just in case the red recording light on the camera blinked on. The silent adjustment had officially begun. We made it to the garage without the interior security cameras catching a single glimpse of Colin standing upright. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I opened the passenger door of my old sedan. I practically lifted my son into the seat. His body felt incredibly heavy, immensely dense as if gravity was actively trying to pull him back into the paralyzed state he had endured for so long. He slumped down the window line immediately. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. The physical exertion of just standing and walking a few feet across the kitchen had drained whatever artificial energy he had left. 2 years of forced sedation had withered his stamina to almost nothing. I threw his folded wheelchair into the trunk, slammed the lid shut, and jumped into the driver's seat. I hit the garage door button and threw the car into reverse before the heavy door was even fully raised. We shot out of the driveway and sped down our quiet suburban street. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Vanessa in her luxury vehicle speeding back to catch us. But the road behind us remained completely empty. The drive to the municipal marina usually took 20 minutes, but today every single traffic light felt like an intentional trap meant to slow us down. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white and my joints ached. Colin was trembling violently next to me. The heavy sedatives and illegal muscle relaxants Vanessa had been feeding him were finally wearing off, and his nervous system was screaming in response to the sudden withdrawal. Cold sweat poured down his pale face. He clenched his jaw tightly, trying desperately to suppress the groans of pain as severe muscle cramps seized his legs. I rolled down the window to let the cool morning air hit his face, but he just tightly closed his eyes and gripped the door handle until his fingers turned purple. I asked him if we should abandon the plan and go straight to a hospital. He vehemently shook his head. He told me that a hospital would require his medical records, which would immediately trigger an alert to his legal guardian. Vanessa would know our exact location within minutes of us walking through the emergency room doors. She would simply show up with her ironclad paperwork and take him away, claiming he was having a severe psychological episode. We had to endure this agonizing ride. He told me to just keep driving. I pressed the gas pedal down further, running a yellow light just as it turned red. My mind raced through the horrific implications of his awakening. My own daughter-in-law had systematically poisoned her husband to maintain a lavish lifestyle. She had watched me wash him, dress him, and mourn him, all while she planned to steal everything our family owned. The sheer evil of her actions was almost impossible to process. But anger was a luxury I could not afford right now. I needed absolute, unwavering focus. We approached the outskirts of the municipal marina. The salty ocean air drifted through the open windows, mixing with the sharp scent of old diesel fuel and drying seaweed. The parking lot was massive, filled with boat trailers and expensive imported cars belonging to the wealthy weekend sailing crowd. I drove slowly down the aisles, my eyes scanning the endless rows of shiny metal and tinted glass. Colin pushed himself up slightly to look out the window. His breathing was still erratic, but his focus was absolutely terrifying. We passed the public docks, the noisy charter boats, and the small commercial fishing vessels. Then, nestled near the private high-security moorings reserved for the elite, we saw it. The pristine, dark gray luxury SUV, her car. I pulled my old sedan into a parking spot several rows away, carefully hiding us behind a massive boat trailer. I turned off the engine. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the sound of Colin catching his breath. She was really here. She was not on a plane heading to the desert. The grand lie was completely exposed, sitting right there on the hot asphalt. I looked at Colin. He nodded silently. We needed to see exactly which boat she was boarding and who she was meeting. I got out of the car and walked around to the passenger side. When I opened his door, Colin tried to stand on his own. His legs gave out immediately. I caught him under the arms before he hit the pavement. He let out a sharp hiss of pain, but he did not give up. I slung his arm over my shoulder, bearing almost all of his weight. We moved slowly, staying entirely in the shadows of the large yachts stored on dry land. Every step was a monumental battle for him. His bare feet dragged against the gravel, but his determination pushed us forward. We crept closer to the private docks, hiding behind a large stack of wooden shipping crates. The gravel crunched softly under my worn loafers as I dragged my son through the maze of dry, docked boats. The midday sun beat down on us mercilessly, turning the narrow corridors between the towering fiberglass hulls into a suffocating oven. Colin was practically dead weight against my side. His breathing was a series of wet, ragged gasps, a terrible sound that echoed in the quiet gaps between the massive vessels. Every few yards, his knees would buckle completely, and I would have to throw my weight against a boat hull, bracing us both to keep from collapsing into the dirt. We moved like hunted animals, darting from the cover of a rusted shipping container to the deep shadow of a massive catamaran. The smell of marine varnish, drying seaweed, and hot asphalt filled my lungs. I could feel the violent tremors racking his body as his nervous system fought a desperate, agonizing war against the vanishing sedatives. He refused to stop. He pointed a trembling finger toward the end of the asphalt row, where the dry dock met the deep water moorings reserved for the private slips. We reached the final barricade of wooden crates just feet from the water edge. I lowered Colin gently to the ground, hiding us behind a stack of thick blue canvas tarps. Through a narrow gap between the slatted wood, we had a perfect, unobstructed view of slip number 4. Floating at the end of the dock was a sleek, mid-sized motor yacht. It was an immaculate vessel painted dark gray, with heavily tinted black windows and a polished teak deck that gleamed in the sunlight. Standing on the aft deck, casually swirling a crystal glass of champagne, was Vanessa. She had changed out of her silk blouse and into a crisp white linen suit. She looked like a billionaire on a holiday retreat, completely unbothered by the blazing heat. Sitting across from her at a small glass patio table was a man in his late 50s. He wore a tailored navy suit that looked entirely out of place on a boat dock. A thick leather briefcase rested on his lap. The gentle lapping of the harbor water against the fiberglass hull carried their voices perfectly across the short distance, broadcasting their treachery directly to us. The man in the navy suit snapped his briefcase open and pulled out a heavy stack of legal documents. He spoke with a smooth, practiced cadence, the voice of a man who sold secrets for a living. He told her that the primary shell company in the Cayman Islands was fully established. He explained that the holding accounts were completely anonymized and shielded behind 3 layers of corporate proxies. He assured her that the moment the domestic funds crossed international lines, they would instantly disperse into 6 different offshore entities, making the money completely untouchable by American federal authorities. Vanessa took a slow sip of her champagne. Her voice was cold, calculating, and completely devoid of the artificial sweetness she used to manipulate me every single day. She demanded to know if the intellectual property transfers were absolutely airtight. She wanted guarantees that her husband and his valuable tech patents could never be reclaimed. The offshore broker nodded smoothly. He told her that because she held the absolute guardianship order and the medical power of attorney, her signature was the only legally binding authority required. He said the patent buyers in Europe were lined up and extremely eager to acquire the technology, but they required the primary asset liquidation to clear first to avoid any domestic legal entanglements. He tapped the thick stack of papers with his index finger. He stated clearly that the equity from the secondary mortgage she secretly took out on my house, along with the liquidated trust funds needed to hit the Cayman account before they would execute the final patent purchases. Hearing her casually discuss the theft of the home I built with my own hands sent a wave of pure nausea through my stomach. Vanessa leaned forward, her eyes narrowing behind her expensive designer sunglasses. She asked exactly how much longer she had to endure the depressing smell of my house and the burden of looking at us. The broker pulled a heavy silver pen from his inside jacket pocket and laid it deliberately on the glass table. He told her the bank required a final physical signature from her in the presence of a senior bank manager to authorize the release of $20 million. He explained that the digital system was fully primed, but the federal security protocols for a wire transfer of that magnitude mandated an in-person verification to prevent fraud. He stated he had scheduled the bank manager to arrive directly at her house this Thursday at 10 in the morning. Thursday meant we had exactly 4 days to stop her. The broker leaned in closer, lowering his voice slightly. He warned her that the entire structure was fragile until Thursday morning. He said any change in her husband's medical status, any hospital visits, or any police involvement before that signature touched the paper would immediately freeze the entire operation pending a federal review. Vanessa threw her head back and actually laughed. It was a sharp, venomous sound that made the blood in my veins run cold. She told the broker he was worrying over absolutely nothing. She boasted that she had crushed a double dose of heavy muscle relaxants into Colin morning meal before she left. She claimed the vegetable would be completely catatonic, staring blankly at the wall for at least another week. She then casually mentioned me. She said the pathetic old man was too stupid, too blindly trusting, and too beaten down to notice anything out of the ordinary. She bragged that by Friday evening, she would be sailing the Mediterranean with $20 million, and the state social services could deal with the two useless burdens she left behind to rot. The sun beat heavily against the back of my neck as I crouched behind the blue canvas tarps. My son was completely exhausted. His body was trembling so violently that the wooden crate we leaned against was actually shaking. We had heard exactly what we needed to hear. We knew about the Cayman Islands shell company. We knew about the forged mortgage on my house. And we knew the deadline was Thursday at 10 in the morning. I whispered to Colin that it was time to leave immediately. We needed to get back to the car before the heavy sedatives completely left his system and the physical pain made him pass out. I wrapped my arm tightly around his waist and hoisted him upward. His legs were like wet sand. He fought through the agony, planting his bare feet into the sharp gravel. We took one agonizing step away from the private slips heading back toward the maze of dry-docked boats. Just as we cleared the first row of towering fiberglass hulls, a loud engine roared to life nearby. A massive travel lift, one of those giant mechanical cranes used to move yachts out of the water, began rolling down the narrow asphalt path directly toward us. Walking right beside the massive machine was a dock worker. He was a large man wearing a bright orange visibility vest and carrying a heavy metal toolbox. He was looking right in our direction. My blood ran completely cold. If he saw my paralyzed son standing upright and walking, he would definitely remember it. If he mentioned it to the wealthy woman in the white suit who was just 50 yards away, our entire strategy would instantly crumble. Vanessa would know the truth before we even reached the highway. Colin tried to move faster to reach the shadows, but his knee completely buckled. He stood tall for a brief second, his arms flailing as he tried to catch his balance. The dock worker was only 20 yards away, now his eyes tracking our frantic movement. I had less than a second to make a decision. To protect my son from a lifetime locked inside a psychiatric facility, I had to hurt him. I grabbed Colin by the shoulders and shoved him backward with all the strength I had left. I pushed my own son violently into the dirt. He hit the ground hard. The sharp gravel tore through his sweatpants and scraped the skin off his elbows. A small cloud of dry dust plumed into the hot air. Colin let out a sharp cry of genuine pain, his body twisting in the dirt. My heart broke into 1,000 pieces seeing him lying there, but the illusion was preserved. He was back on the ground, helpless and immobile. The dock worker dropped his metal toolbox. It hit the asphalt with a massive ringing clang that echoed off every boat hull in the yard. He sprinted toward us, waving his hands. He shouted loudly, asking if we were okay and what had happened. I immediately dropped to my knees beside Colin, playing the part of the panicked, incompetent elderly caregiver. I stammered, my voice shaking with manufactured fear. I told the worker that my son was completely paralyzed. I lied and said our wheelchair had gotten stuck in the deep gravel back by the parking lot, and I had foolishly tried to carry him to the water so he could feel the ocean breeze. I said I was too old and weak, and I had accidentally dropped him. The dock worker immediately softened. He knelt down gently, telling me it was all right and that he would help me carry him back to the car. Colin played his part perfectly. He let his limbs go completely limp, acting like a lifeless rag doll as the large man placed a supportive arm under his back. But the ringing clang of the dropped toolbox had been entirely too loud. The noise had carried directly down the pier. The sharp rhythmic clicking of expensive high heels sounded on the wooden dock, The noise grew louder and faster. I looked over my shoulder and saw Vanessa marching toward us. She had left her champagne glass on the yacht. Her white linen suit was immaculate, but her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She stopped a few feet away from us, her eyes darting from the dock worker to me, and finally resting on her husband, lying in the dirt. The dock worker looked up at her, offering a friendly, reassuring smile. He told her there was no need to worry, explaining that the poor old man had just lost his footing while trying to show his disabled son the boats. He said he was just about to help us back to the parking lot. Vanessa did not thank him. She did not even acknowledge his kindness. Instead, she looked down at me with a gaze so cold it felt like a physical strike to the chest. She spoke in a loud, clear voice, ensuring the offshore broker on the yacht could hear her. She called me a pathetic, senile old fool. She demanded to know what I was thinking, dragging her severely disabled husband through a filthy boatyard. She asked the dock worker to step away, claiming I was dangerously incompetent and that she would call a private medical transport. The dock worker looked incredibly uncomfortable, stepping back awkwardly as Vanessa continued her public execution of my character. She told me I was a useless burden. She said I could not even handle a simple walk without endangering the life of my son. Every single word was designed to strip away my dignity, to establish her absolute dominance, and to make sure the broker saw her as the long-suffering wife burdened with complete idiots. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I kept my head bowed, staring at the dust on my worn shoes. I let her pour every ounce of her venom onto my shoulders. I apologized softly, my voice trembling, playing the role of the defeated, humiliated father-in-law to absolute perfection. I told her I just wanted to give him some fresh air. She scoffed loudly, a sound filled with utter disgust. She ordered me to go retrieve the wheelchair from the parking lot immediately and clean the dirt off her husband. She turned her back on us and marched confidently back toward her waiting yacht and her $20 million escape plan. I stayed on my knees in the dirt next to my son, swallowing the bitter taste of humiliation, knowing that her absolute arrogance had just given us the exact window of time we needed to destroy her. I left my son sitting in the hot dirt just long enough to run back to the parking lot and retrieve the folding wheelchair. My lungs burned as I pushed it over the uneven gravel, but I could not afford to rest for a single second. I lifted Colin from the ground, his clothes covered in gray dust, and his elbows scraped raw, and carefully strapped him into the nylon seat. I pushed him rapidly back to my old sedan, hoisted his dead weight into the passenger side, and threw the chair heavily into the trunk. The moment I closed my car door, the heavy silence of the vehicle swallowed us whole. I turned the ignition. The air conditioning blasted against our sweating faces, but it did nothing to cool the absolute terror burning inside my chest. I drove slowly out of the marina parking lot, watching Vanessa's dark gray luxury vehicle shrink and disappear in my rearview mirror. The ride back to our sprawling colonial house was agonizingly quiet. Outside the windows, the world carried on in perfect, blissful ignorance. People were watering their front lawns and teenagers were riding bicycles under the bright afternoon sun. Inside my car, however, the atmosphere was suffocating. Colin pressed his forehead against the cool passenger window glass. His breathing was shallow, wet, and erratic. The raw adrenaline that had fueled his miraculous recovery in the kitchen was entirely gone. In its place was the brutal, unyielding reality of heavy chemical withdrawal. His muscles twitched involuntarily. He squeezed his eyes shut as violent, agonizing spasms racked his legs, his hands gripping the seatbelt so tightly, his knuckles turned white, but he refused to make a sound. I wanted to reach out to comfort him, to tell him everything would be all right, but we both knew empty promises were completely useless right now. We were trapped in an invisible cage constructed of ironclad legal documents. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, methodically breaking down the timeline out loud, so we both understood the extreme gravity of our situation. We had exactly 4 days, 96 hours until Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. That was the exact moment the senior bank manager would sit at my dining room table and watch Vanessa physically sign away my home and my son's life work. I ran through every possible scenario, desperately searching for a loophole. I told Colin we could drive straight to the local police precinct or the federal field office. He weakly shook his head without opening his eyes, his voice barely a raspy whisper over the hum of the engine. He reminded me of the offshore broker's warning on the dock. The Cayman Islands Shell Company was fully established and waiting. Any sudden police involvement, any emergency hospital visits, or any erratic behavior from us would immediately alert Vanessa to our knowledge. She would claim Colin was having a violent psychotic break induced by his trauma. She held the absolute medical power of attorney. She held the court-ordered guardianship. The police would look at the forged secondary mortgage, see her legal authority over the estate, and dismiss my warnings as the ramblings of a bitter, senile father-in-law. Then she would lock Colin in a state-run psychiatric ward permanently and finalize the $20 million wire transfer from the comfort of a hotel room. We could not fight her with the law because she currently owned the law. We could not fight her with force because I was a 65-year-old man and my son was fighting off 2 years of heavy sedation. We only had one weapon left at our disposal, and that was her absolute, unwavering arrogance. She truly believed I was a broken, incompetent fool. She truly believed her husband was a drooling vegetable. She believed the drugs were keeping him docile, and her financial manipulations were completely untraceable. We had to use her supreme confidence against her. I turned the car onto our quiet, tree-lined street. I told Colin that when we walked through the front door, we had to step directly back into the nightmare. We had to perform our roles perfectly under the watchful lenses of her interior security cameras. We had to swallow the poison and pretend we were completely defeated. I pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, and looked at my son. He slowly opened his eyes, staring at the house that had become his prison. He nodded once. The battle lines were drawn in total silence. I pulled the sedan into the dark garage and immediately hit the button to lower the heavy wooden door behind us. The mechanical hum of the motor shutting out the bright afternoon sun felt like the ceiling of a tomb. We had barely any time before Vanessa logged into the interior security network from her phone. I rushed around to the passenger side and practically dragged my son out of the seat. Colin was completely drenched in cold sweat, his skin clammy and incredibly pale. The violent withdrawal symptoms from the missing sedatives were actively ravaging his nervous system. His breathing was a series of jagged, wet gasps, and his legs were trembling so severely he could not support his own weight for more than a second. I wrapped my arms tightly around his chest, acting as his sole physical support, and hauled him through the laundry room door. Every single step across the tiled floor was a monumental physical battle. He groaned in absolute agony as his muscles cramped, fighting against the sudden demand to function after 2 years of forced chemical paralysis. We were racing against a ticking clock, and every second felt like a grueling eternity. We made it to the center of the living room with mere moments to spare. I pushed his wheelchair out of the corner and into the exact position it had been when she left that morning. I lowered him heavily into the seat. He collapsed against the synthetic leather, his body utterly drained of the adrenaline that had carried us through the marina. But we could not allow ourselves to rest. The visual illusion had to be absolutely perfect. I grabbed a woven throw blanket from the sofa and draped it carefully over his lap. I tucked the edges in tightly, ensuring I completely hid the gray dirt stains and the raw bleeding scrapes on his elbows from our desperate fall at the harbor. I adjusted his posture, tilting his head forward so his chin rested heavily against his chest. I whispered for him to let his jaw go completely slack, to unfocus his eyes, and to stare blankly at the wooden baseboards. I took a step back and inspected him from the angle of the camera. A fresh wave of absolute heartbreak washed over me, seeing my intelligent, capable son willingly morph back into the broken vegetative prisoner she had created. But his performance was flawless. He looked exactly like the helpless burden she believed him to be. I turned away from him and rushed to the kitchen sink. I grabbed a damp dish towel and began frantically scrubbing the marble countertops. I hunched my shoulders forward, deliberately, adopting the defeated, exhausted posture of an old man who had completely given up on life. Less than 10 seconds later, a tiny mechanical click echoed sharply from the upper corner of the ceiling. The small black domed camera mounted above the glass cabinets rotated slightly on its axis. A solid red light flickered to life on its plastic base. She was watching us. Somewhere on that luxury yacht surrounded by ocean air and stolen money, Vanessa had pulled out her smartphone to check her digital cage. The air in the kitchen grew incredibly thick and heavy. I could physically feel the invisible weight of her gaze burning into the back of my neck through the lens. I continued wiping the spotless counter, making my hands shake slightly, playing the part of the obedient servant who was terrified of making a mistake. From the corner of my eye, I watched Colin closely. The heavy chemical sedatives were rapidly leaving his bloodstream, and his body was violently demanding the poison it had grown accustomed to. I saw a massive muscle spasm ripple forcefully through his right thigh under the woven blanket. His fingers resting limply on the black armrests began to twitch involuntarily. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second, his face pale as he fought back a wave of sheer physical agony. If she zoomed in with her phone application, if she noticed the rigid tension in his hands, or the sweat beading on his forehead, our entire counterattack would be destroyed before it even began. I dropped the dish towel onto the marble, walked slowly over to him, and deliberately blocked the camera line of sight with my body. I loudly announced to the empty room that I was going to read him a book, making sure my voice carried a pathetic, trembling tone. I grabbed a worn paperback novel from the coffee table, sat heavily in the armchair beside him, and began reading aloud. I kept my back firmly to the lens, shielding his shaking body with my own silhouette. This precise moment was the true beginning of our silent war. We were no longer victims, passively waiting for the inevitable end. We were soldiers operating deep behind enemy lines, wearing the exact camouflage our captor had assigned to us. Vanessa thrived on absolute control and absolute superiority. She drew her immense power from the unwavering belief that she was the smartest, most ruthless person in any room. Our strategy was to feed that supreme arrogance until she choked on it. We would give her exactly what she expected to see every single time she looked at her screen. We would let her believe her masterful plan was executing flawlessly without a single complication. Every time that red light blinked on, she would see nothing but a helpless vegetable and an incompetent old fool. She would lower her guard, completely secure in the knowledge that her Thursday morning victory was entirely guaranteed. But while she slept, while she drank expensive wine on the water, while she planned her grand escape to the Mediterranean coast, we were going to tear the foundation of her entire life apart brick by brick. The physical toll on Colin was going to be excruciating, and the emotional toll on me was going to be suffocating, but we had crossed the point of no return. I kept my eyes focused on the pages of the book, reading words I did not comprehend, listening to the shallow, painful breaths of my son. The red light on the camera burned like a demon eye in the corner of the room, but I did not flinch. The psychological warfare had officially begun, and we were prepared to suffer in absolute silence to ensure our final victory. The sun finally set behind the dense pine trees surrounding the property, casting long, dark shadows across the living room floor. I waited until exactly 9 in the evening. This was the exact time Vanessa always ordered me to turn off the main lights and put Colin to bed. I performed the nightly routine flawlessly under the watchful eye of the ceiling camera. I wheeled my son into his ground floor bedroom, transferred his exhausted body onto the mattress, and pulled the heavy blanket up to his chest. I turned off the bedside lamp, leaving the room in complete darkness. Colin immediately reached out in the pitch black and squeezed my hand twice. It was our silent signal. He was safe for now. I slipped out of his room, avoiding the specific floorboards I knew would creak, and made my way silently down the hall to the home office. This room used to be my personal sanctuary. It was where I kept my favorite books, my comfortable leather armchair, and the records of my long career. Vanessa had completely gutted it the moment she took control. Now it was a sterile, minimalist workspace decorated with expensive, modern art and a sleek glass desk. Sitting perfectly in the center of that glass desk was her silver laptop. It was the nerve center of her entire criminal operation. I closed the heavy office door silently behind me and locked it. I pulled the window blinds tightly shut. I sat down in her designer ergonomic chair and woke the computer. A bright login screen illuminated the dark room, demanding a password to proceed. Vanessa always treated me like a useless, uneducated old man. She assumed my 30 years of working to pay off this house meant I was a simple laborer with no intellect to speak of. She never once bothered to learn about my actual career. Before I retired, I spent 3 decades working as a senior forensic accountant for a major firm in the city. My entire professional life was dedicated to tracking hidden assets, dismantling fraudulent corporate shell companies, and exposing elaborate financial crimes. I hunted liars and thieves for a living. I placed my hands on the cold aluminum keyboard. Vanessa was incredibly careful, but she was also deeply, fatally narcissistic. I knew she would never use a random string of generated characters for her password. Her absolute vanity would demand something that constantly validated her own ego. I bypassed the standard attempts like birthdays and wedding anniversaries. I thought about the one thing she bragged about constantly during her first year of marriage to my son. I typed in the exact dollar amount of the first major tech patent Colin ever sold, followed by her own initials in capital letters. The system rejected it immediately. I paused, taking a slow, steady breath. I thought deeper about her twisted psychology and her need for absolute dominance. I typed the exact date she successfully secured the guardianship over my son, followed by the word victory. The screen froze for a fraction of a second. Then the locked screen dissolved entirely, revealing her pristine digital desktop. I was in. I did not waste a single second celebrating. I bypassed her standard folders and dove directly into the hidden system files. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a speed and precision I thought I had lost many years ago. I opened her private email client and began pulling the archived attachments. The digital paper trail she left behind was absolutely staggering in its pure arrogance. She had not even bothered to deeply encrypt the local files because she genuinely believed no one in this house possessed the mental capacity to open the machine. I found the master ledger first. It was a detailed spreadsheet meticulously tracking every single royalty payment from Colin and his tech patents over the last 5 years. But the money was not going into his medical trust for his care. It was being systematically siphoned into a series of offshore holding accounts. Then I found the property documents. My stomach violently turned as I opened a scanned electronic file. It was a massive secondary mortgage taken out against my colonial home. I stared at the bottom of the final page. My own signature was resting perfectly on the dotted line. She had forged my handwriting with terrifying accuracy. She had leveraged the entire equity of the house I built with my own hands to secure a massive line of credit from an aggressive private lender. If the bank executed the wire transfer on Thursday, the lender would immediately foreclose on the property, and I would be thrown into the street with absolutely nothing to my name. Every single asset my family owned was tied directly to that Thursday morning deadline. But a glaring question remained in my mind. Why was she executing this total liquidation right now? The patent royalties provided her with a lavish, endless stream of income. Stealing the entire principal and fleeing the country was a massive, unnecessary risk, unless she was being actively forced to run. I opened her deleted internet history and cross-referenced the dates with her largest bank withdrawals. The brutal truth finally emerged from the digital shadows. Vanessa had not just been buying designer clothes and luxury cars. She had been quietly hemorrhaging millions of dollars into high-risk, completely unregulated digital currency markets. Over the last 18 months, that specific market had completely crashed, and she had desperately doubled down using the forged secondary mortgage money to cover her catastrophic financial losses. she was completely underwater. The Cayman Islands Shell Company was not just an early retirement plan. It was a desperate, panicked bailout to escape the massive debt she had accrued under my son and his name before the private lenders came looking for their money. I copied every single document, every spreadsheet, and every forged signature onto a small encrypted flash drive I kept on my keychain. I finally had the absolute proof of her financial treason. I safely ejected the drive, cleared the recent access logs to hide my tracks, and shut the laptop down. The screen went black, plunging the office back into darkness. The hunter had finally returned to the field. I sat alone in the dark office with the small encrypted flash drive resting heavily in my pocket. The digital evidence of her massive financial crimes was entirely secured, but my victory felt hollow. Having proof of her past theft was simply not enough to prevent the impending disaster. Exposing her hidden cryptocurrency losses to the authorities would trigger a massive investigation, but it would not freeze the Thursday morning wire transfer in time. The aggressive private lenders would still foreclose on my generational home long before the slow wheels of the justice system could intervene to protect us. I needed to strike directly at the absolute heart of her operation. I needed to legally dissolve the primary trust account that held my son and his patents before the senior bank manager ever walked through my front door. I turned my intense focus back to the glowing screen of her silver laptop. I opened her internet browser and systematically navigated through her saved financial bookmarks. I quickly located the primary access portal for the central banking institution managing the estate. A sterile login screen appeared demanding the administrative credentials. I relied on the exact same psychological deduction that had successfully cracked her laptop password. I typed the date of her guardianship victory, followed by her initials. The banking system accepted the input immediately. The portal transitioned to the main administrative dashboard of the family trust. The screen displayed the staggering total of the liquidated assets. The money was sitting perfectly still in the holding account, simply waiting for the final Thursday authorization to cross the ocean. I moved the digital cursor deliberately toward the advanced administrative settings menu. My intention was straightforward and aggressive. I planned to freeze the account entirely, scramble the international routing numbers, or initiate a permanent lockdown protocol from the inside. I clicked the button to modify the core trust permissions. The screen instantly blurred out the massive financial numbers in the background. A small white box popped up in the absolute center of the display. The red text inside the box demanded an immediate secondary security authorization. I assumed it would be a standard security question or a simple authentication code sent directly to her mobile device. I was completely prepared to wait until she returned and steal her phone in the middle of the night to intercept the text message. But the detailed instructions inside the white box sent a wave of pure ice down my spine. The banking institution did not want a simple text message code. The portal explicitly required a live biometric signature to alter any fundamental conditions of the primary trust. A small animation of a fingerprint appeared on the screen, accompanied by a glowing icon of a microphone. Vanessa had anticipated digital attacks. She had upgraded the security protocols to the highest possible institutional tier. To move the money, to change the ownership, or to dissolve the trust from this computer, the system strictly required either her physical thumbprint, firmly pressed on the laptop scanner, or a live voice authorization matching her exact vocal print perfectly. I stared at the blinking security prompt in absolute disbelief. My 30 years of forensic accounting experience were completely useless against this modern physical barrier. I could track hidden money across a dozen international borders, and I could expose the most complicated corporate shell companies, but I could not digitally replicate her physical fingerprint. I could not synthesize her exact voice to trick the banking system. The digital door was slammed shut and locked from the inside with an unbreakable key. I gently closed the laptop down, plunging the quiet office back into total darkness. I leaned back in the designer leather chair and rubbed my exhausted eyes, listening to the heavy silence of the sleeping house. The crushing reality of our situation settled heavily upon my tired shoulders. Digital hacking was a complete dead end. We could not break into the financial system from the outside. The only way to dissolve the trust and protect my paralyzed son was from the inside. We needed the absolute highest authority on the account to authorize the dissolution. We needed Vanessa. She was the only person on Earth who possessed the biometric keys to unlock the vault. We needed her physical presence and her explicit authorization. The irony of the situation was sharp and incredibly bitter. The exact security measures she had installed to protect her stolen wealth were now the only things standing between us and our freedom. I sat in the quiet dark, slowly piecing together a completely new strategy. If I could not steal the keys digitally, I had to make her hand them over willingly in the physical world. I had to create a high-pressure situation where she would physically sign a document or authorize a transfer without realizing she was actively dismantling her own criminal empire. I had to weaponize her extreme impatience and her absolute contempt for me. She viewed every single interaction with me as an annoying chore to be swatted away as quickly as possible. I would have to use that supreme arrogance to trick her into signing her own downfall. I stood up from the chair and quietly unlocked the office door, knowing exactly what kind of legal ally I needed to find the moment the morning sun came up. The morning sun barely crested the horizon when I finalized my plan to seek legal counsel. I had stayed awake the entire night, plotting my escape from the digital surveillance. My intention was to leave the house exactly at 8 to visit a retired corporate litigator I knew from decades ago. I stood in the kitchen quietly packing a small canvas bag with the encrypted flash drive and my physical identification documents. I poured a cup of black coffee and stared out the window toward the quiet street. The neighborhood was entirely still. I felt a fleeting sense of hope that I could execute this legal maneuver and secure my son before the Thursday deadline. I turned to walk toward the garage to start my old sedan. A sudden heavy crunch of gravel in the driveway froze my blood. It was not even 7 in the morning. I stepped back into the shadow of the kitchen island and peered through the edge of the window blinds. A massive black utility vehicle pulled aggressively into my driveway, completely blocking my old sedan inside the garage. The engine idled loudly for a few seconds before shutting off. The driver's side door opened, and my heart plummeted into my stomach. It was Vanessa. She had returned exactly 3 days earlier than her scheduled mental health retreat was supposed to end. She was not in Sedona, and she was no longer on the luxury yacht. She wore a sharp black suit, and her face carried a tight expression of absolute determination. The sheer panic of being discovered flooded my mind. I wondered if the dock worker from the marina had said something else, or if she had somehow checked the security cameras and noticed my deliberate shielding of my son. I quickly shoved my canvas bag into the bottom cabinet under the sink and grabbed my dish towel to resume my pathetic servant disguise. Before Vanessa even reached the front steps, the passenger door of the heavy vehicle swung open. A man stepped out onto the driveway. He was easily 6 feet and 4 inches tall, with a thick, muscular build that stretched the fabric of his dark gray shirt. He had a shaved head and a flat, emotionless face. He moved with the calculated, heavy steps of someone completely accustomed to physical violence. He did not look like a medical professional. He looked like a hired enforcer. He pulled a large black duffel bag from the back seat and followed Vanessa to the front door. The lock clicked loudly, and the heavy oak door swung open. I stood in the center of the kitchen, clutching the dish towel, trying to control my breathing. Vanessa walked in, dropping her expensive leather purse onto the console table. She did not look tired or relaxed. She looked like a general returning to a battlefield to oversee the final execution of her strategy. She walked directly into the kitchen and sneered at me. She announced in a flat, cold tone that her trip to the desert was entirely too boring, and she had decided to cut her retreat short. She gestured toward the massive man standing silently in the hallway behind her. She introduced him as a specialist physical therapist she had hired at a premium rate to evaluate her husband and provide aggressive muscle rehabilitation. She lied with absolute perfection. She told me this specialist required a highly controlled environment to work, and that my constant hovering was a severe detriment to medical progress. The large man did not smile, and he did not offer his hand for me to shake. He simply stared at me with cold, dead eyes, sizing up my physical weakness. I immediately understood the brutal reality of the situation. He was not there to rehabilitate my son. He was a mercenary hired to physically guarantee that my son remained completely incapacitated and that I remained entirely neutralized until the bank manager arrived on Thursday morning. The offshore broker had warned her about the fragility of her plan, and she had brought in heavy muscle to eliminate any possibility of a last-minute complication. Vanessa stepped closer to me, extending her manicured hand. She demanded the keys to my old sedan. She claimed the physical therapist needed to park his large vehicle inside the garage to unload specialized medical equipment and that my car was in the way. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, knowing that surrendering my keys meant giving up my only immediate mode of transportation. The massive man took one slow, deliberate step forward into the kitchen space. The silent threat of physical violence hung heavily in the morning air. I reached into my pocket and placed my car keys into her waiting palm. She dropped them into her purse with a satisfied smirk. She then dictated the new rules of the house. She told me I was no longer permitted to enter the ground floor bedroom where my son was sleeping. She said the specialist would handle all feeding, all bathing, and all medication administration from this point forward. She instructed me to confine myself to my small guest room and the kitchen. She explicitly forbade me from wandering the house or interrupting the therapy sessions. She effectively placed me under strict house arrest inside the home I had paid for, with 30 years of hard labor. The psychological warfare had instantly escalated into a physical siege. Vanessa walked down the hallway to her master bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the towering enforcer. He walked slowly past me, his broad shoulders barely clearing the distance between the kitchen island and the refrigerator. He did not speak a single word to me. He walked directly to the bedroom door of my son, turned the brass handle, and stepped inside. He left the door wide open, allowing me to see the space but completely blocking my entry with his massive frame. I watched as he dropped his heavy black duffel bag onto the floor. I knew exactly what was inside that bag. It was not medical equipment. It was a fresh supply of heavy chemical sedatives meant to force my son back into a permanent vegetative state. My son was currently suffering through severe withdrawal tremors, and his mind was finally clear. The moment that enforcer tried to force a new pill down his throat, my son would inevitably fight back. He would refuse to swallow the poison, and the enforcer would use brutal physical force to complete his job. The walls of my colonial home felt like they were rapidly shrinking, crushing the air out of my lungs. I was trapped inside without a vehicle, without access to my son, and under the constant supervision of a violent mercenary. The deadline of Thursday morning was looming just one day away, and my window of opportunity to leave the house to find my lawyer had been violently slammed shut. I stood by the kitchen sink, gripping the marble counter so tightly my fingers throbbed. I had to find a way to communicate with my son inside that room. I had to prevent the enforcer from administering the next dose of poison without triggering an outright physical brawl that I would certainly lose. I had to bypass the massive man, retrieve my legal ally, and dissolve the primary trust, all while Vanessa watched our every move. The conflict had chained itself perfectly into a devastating knot. Every single path forward seemed entirely blocked by an impenetrable wall of muscle and legal authority. I swallowed my rising panic and began to calculate my next move, knowing that any mistake now would cost my son his freedom and me my life. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed noon. I walked into the living room where Vanessa was sitting on the expensive sofa, scrolling through her phone. The massive enforcer stood like a stone statue outside my son's sleeping quarters. I kept my eyes lowered and my voice perfectly steady. I told Vanessa we were completely out of the specialized liquid nutrition Colin required for his afternoon feeding. I said I needed to drive to the pharmacy and the grocery store immediately to ensure he did not miss a meal. She did not even look up from her glowing screen. She simply waved her hand, dismissing me like a stray dog. She warned me that I had exactly 1 hour to return, or the physical therapist would begin his aggressive muscle treatments without me present. The threat was crystal clear. If I delayed my return, my son would suffer the physical consequences. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the front door. Leaving Colin alone in that house with a hired mercenary was the hardest thing I have ever done. But it was the only way to secure our ultimate survival. I drove my old sedan 3 towns over, making sure I was not being followed by anyone. I bypassed the local grocery store entirely and pulled into the empty parking lot of a rundown community park. Sitting on a rusted green bench under a massive oak tree was Warren. Warren was 68 years old and a retired corporate litigator who used to strike fear into the hearts of Wall Street executives. 30 years ago, when my small accounting firm was targeted by a vicious corporate smear campaign, Warren stepped in and completely destroyed the opposition. I had saved his brother from a catastrophic bankruptcy a decade prior, and Warren told me that life debt would never expire. I sat down on the wooden bench next to him, handing him the encrypted flash drive I had loaded the night before. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the entire horrific reality of my paralyzed son, the forged secondary mortgage, and the Cayman Islands shell company. Warren plugged the small drive into a sleek tablet he pulled from his leather briefcase. His sharp eyes scanned the digital documents. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head at the sheer audacity of her financial crimes. I told him I wanted to march into a courthouse and file an emergency injunction to strip her guardianship and freeze the Thursday wire transfer. Warren immediately shot down that idea. He spoke with the cold, clinical precision of a veteran lawyer. He explained that challenging a bulletproof medical power of attorney and a court-ordered guardianship would take several months of grueling litigation. Vanessa would simply claim I was a disgruntled relative experiencing severe cognitive decline. By the time a judge even agreed to hear my preliminary case, the $20 million would be entirely vanished into the offshore accounts, and my home would be foreclosed by the private lenders. A frontal legal assault was guaranteed suicide. Warren looked me directly in the eyes and outlined the only viable counterattack. He called it an inside-out trust dissolution. He explained that because Vanessa held the absolute primary authority over the estate, she was the only human being on Earth who could legally authorize the immediate transfer of the patent rights and the house equity. We could not fight her authority, but we could hijack it. Warren proposed drafting a highly complex corporate restructuring agreement. He said he would meticulously format the document to look exactly like a standard medical liability waiver. It would contain all the typical pharmaceutical warnings and caregiver release clauses on the front page. But buried deep within the dense legal terminology of the second page would be an irrevocable transfer of all liquid assets, patent portfolios, and property deeds into a newly formed blind trust controlled solely by me. If Vanessa physically signed that specific document, she would unknowingly dissolve her own financial empire and legally hand every single asset back to our family. I asked Warren how quickly he could establish the new blind trust and finalize the Trojan horse document. He closed his tablet and placed it back into his briefcase. He told me he would pull every favor he had left in the legal system to have the paperwork legally registered and printed by tomorrow evening. He warned me that the entire strategy hinged entirely on my ability to make a hyper-vigilant, manipulative woman sign a document without reading the fine print. I stood up from the park bench feeling a renewed surge of absolute determination. I thanked my old friend and promised to contact him the moment the trap was sprung. I drove straight to the grocery store, bought the liquid nutrition, and raced back to my colonial house. The legal weapon was currently being forged, and I had to keep my son alive long enough to use it. The following afternoon, a courier in a plain gray uniform arrived at the front door. He handed me a sealed manila envelope. I signed for the package with a trembling hand, acutely aware of the security camera above my head and the massive enforcer sitting just down the hallway outside my son's sleeping quarters. I took the envelope straight to the small guest bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the twin bed. I carefully sliced the paper open. Inside was the weapon Warren had forged for us. It was a stack of thick legal paper exactly 4 pages long, fastened with a simple metal staple. I read through the document completely in awe of the absolute brilliance of my old friend. Warren had not just drafted a contract. He had engineered a perfect, inescapable legal trap. The first 2 pages of the document were a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Warren had formatted the text to look exactly like a standard medical liability waiver from a high-end physical therapy clinic. The font was small, dense, and entirely uninviting. The header featured a generic corporate logo, and the title explicitly stated it was a comprehensive waiver of liability for experimental muscle rehabilitation techniques. Warren knew exactly how Vanessa operated. She viewed the medical care of my son as an annoying, repulsive chore. She had hired the violent mercenary to avoid dealing with the physical reality of the situation. When presented with a boring medical document requiring her signature to proceed with the therapy, she would not read the details. She would simply scan the title, feel a wave of intense irritation, and sign the bottom line just to get the paper out of her sight. The text on the first page was filled with heavy, authentic medical jargon. It detailed the potential side effects of deep tissue manipulation, the risks of sudden muscle spasms, and the release of all legal claims against the physical therapist in the event of accidental injury. It explicitly mentioned the necessity of the heavy sedatives, a detail Warren had included specifically to give the document an air of absolute legitimacy. Vanessa would see the word sedatives and instantly assume the paperwork was just a bureaucratic hurdle required by her hired enforcer. She would never suspect that the very mechanism she was using to keep my son paralyzed was being used as the camouflage for her own destruction. But the true genius of the document began at the bottom of the second page. Warren had employed a technique he called legal blending. The sentences smoothly transitioned from discussing medical liability into discussing the financial liability of the patient. The paragraphs grew longer, and the syntax became deliberately convoluted. Without any breaks or new headings to alert the reader, the document shifted entirely from medical care to asset management. This was the corporate restructuring agreement hidden in plain sight. The third page was where the lethal blow was struck. Warren had drafted a clause stating that to protect the financial assets of the patient from potential medical malpractice lawsuits, the primary trust was to be immediately and permanently dissolved. The exact legal language was dense, impenetrable, and absolutely binding. It stated that the signatory acting in their full capacity as the legal guardian and holder of the medical power of attorney willfully authorized the complete liquidation of the current estate. Furthermore, it explicitly directed the immediate transfer of all intellectual property, all tech patent rights, and the total equity of the colonial home into a newly established, irrevocable blind trust. The final page designated the sole executor and primary beneficiary of this new blind trust. It listed my full name. It did not leave a single loophole. It did not leave a fraction of a percent open to interpretation. By signing the final page, Vanessa would not be authorizing a physical therapy treatment. She would be legally stripping herself of every single asset she had stolen, transferring absolute control of the wealth directly into my hands, and simultaneously destroying the Cayman Islands shell company before the bank manager even arrived to fund it. I read the clauses over and over again, marveling at the airtight construction of the language. Warren had weaponized her own legal authority against her. The medical power of attorney and the court-ordered guardianship were the exact tools she used to torture my son. Now those same documents gave her the absolute authority to sign this new agreement. When she placed her signature on the dotted line, she would be executing a legally binding transfer of wealth that no court in the country could immediately overturn. She was the supreme authority over the estate, and she was about to use that power to bankrupt herself. I placed the documents back into the manila envelope and slid it under my mattress. The trap was fully set. The bait was perfectly designed to exploit her fatal arrogance and her supreme impatience. All I had to do now was wait for the final morning. I had to survive one more night in this house under the suffocating watch of the hired mercenary. I had to ensure my son survived the agonizing physical withdrawal of the sedatives without revealing his recovery. And tomorrow morning, I had to walk up to the woman who had systematically destroyed my family, look her directly in the eyes, and hand her the pen that would end her entire criminal empire. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the living room walls. I walked out of the guest bedroom, leaving the hidden envelope safely under my mattress. The final night in my own house felt like walking through a maximum security prison. The air was thick and suffocating. The massive hired enforcer sat on a wooden dining chair, positioned directly outside my sun-open bedroom door. His thick arms were crossed over his chest, and his cold eyes tracked my every single movement. He did not blink and he did not speak. He was a human barricade designed to keep me away from Colin and to ensure the physical illusion remained entirely intact. I walked slowly into the kitchen, pretending to organize the pantry, just to have a legitimate reason to stay within a few feet of the bedroom. Inside the room, Colin was fighting the most agonizing battle of his entire life. The heavy chemical sedatives had been out of his system for nearly 36 hours. His nervous system was completely raw and screaming for the poison it had grown entirely dependent upon. I could see him lying on the bed under the thin cotton sheet. His body was violently betraying him. Severe tremors racked his legs and arms, sending visible ripples across the fabric of the blanket. The muscles in his neck were completely rigid, as he fought with every ounce of his remaining willpower to suppress the involuntary spasms. He was sweating profusely. His skin was pale and damp, shining in the dim light of the hallway. He had to remain completely motionless, playing the role of a paralyzed vegetable while his entire body felt like it was actively burning from the inside out. It was a display of sheer superhuman endurance. Every shallow breath he took sounded like sharp glass scraping against his throat, but he absolutely refused to groan. He knew the massive man sitting just 10 feet away was actively looking for any excuse to intervene. The silence in the house was absolute, making every tiny sound feel like a gunshot. The wooden floorboards creaked under the weight of the enforcer as he leaned forward in his chair. His dead eyes narrowed. He had noticed the subtle, unnatural twitching of the blanket over my son's legs. He stood up slowly, his massive frame blocking out the light from the hallway. He took 2 heavy steps into the bedroom. My heart slammed against my ribs. I grabbed a plastic container of dry pasta from the counter and deliberately dropped it onto the kitchen floor, creating a loud clattering noise to distract him. The enforcer snapped his head toward me, his jaw clenched in pure irritation. I immediately dropped to my knees, apologizing profusely, playing the part of the clumsy, terrified old man. I scrambled on the floor, gathering the spilled noodles, muttering about my failing eyesight and my terrible arthritis. The enforcer scoffed loudly and turned his attention back to the bed. He walked right up to the edge of the mattress and leaned over my son. He stared directly into Colin's face, inspecting him like a piece of broken machinery. I held my breath, terrified that my son would open his eyes and reveal the sharp, clear focus of a fully conscious man. But Colin played his part with absolute perfection. He let his jaw hang completely slack and allowed his eyes to roll slightly back into his head, presenting the exact vacant stare Vanessa had cultivated for 2 years. The enforcer grunted in satisfaction, completely convinced that the severe tremors were just random neurological misfires of a shattered spine. He turned around and walked heavily back to his wooden chair, resuming his silent watch. The hours dragged on with agonizing slowness. I remained in the kitchen, wiping down the same spotless marble counter over and over again, simply to maintain my physical proximity. Midnight came and went. The house was completely silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the jagged, painful breathing of my son. I watched the clock on the microwave slowly tick toward 2 in the morning. Every single minute felt like carrying a heavy boulder up a steep hill. Colin was deteriorating rapidly under the physical strain of the severe withdrawal. His face was contorted in silent agony, and the sheets were completely soaked with his sweat. I wanted nothing more than to rush into that room, hold his hand, and tell him that we were only hours away from absolute victory. But I was trapped behind an invisible line I could not cross. I sat down on a wooden stool, staring at the broad back of the mercenary. I knew the morning would bring the ultimate test. Vanessa would wake up, demand the morning feeding, and expect the final dose of heavy sedatives to be administered before her bank meeting. The enforcer was explicitly hired to handle that exact task. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. We were sitting on a powder keg, and the fuse was burning rapidly toward the explosive flashpoint. I closed my eyes for a brief second, praying that my son could hold on to his sanity and his physical strength for just a few more hours. The morning light broke through the kitchen blinds, casting pale yellow lines across the marble countertops. It was Wednesday morning. We had less than 24 hours until the senior bank manager arrived to execute the final wire transfer. The massive hired enforcer stood by the kitchen island, preparing the morning routine. I watched him from the corner of my eye, pretending to wipe down the stove. He unzipped his black duffel bag and pulled out a small plastic bottle filled with heavy white pills. These were the high-dose sedatives Vanessa used to keep my son trapped inside his own body. The enforcer poured 3 thick pills into the palm of his hand. He grabbed a heavy metal spoon and systematically crushed them into a fine white powder against the marble surface. He scooped the powder into a small bowl of oatmeal and stirred it aggressively. Every scrape of the metal spoon echoed in the quiet kitchen, sounding like a death knell for our entire strategy. He picked up the bowl and turned toward the hallway. He was going to force that poison down the throat of my son. Colin was currently lying in the ground floor bedroom, completely ravaged by the physical agony of chemical withdrawal. His nervous system was screaming, and his muscles were locked in violent spasms. He had spent the entire night fighting to remain perfectly still under the watchful eye of the mercenary. If the enforcer poured that spiked oatmeal into his mouth, Colin would instinctively gag and fight back. The massive man would instantly realize my son was no longer a paralyzed vegetable. He would use brutal physical violence to subdue him, and he would immediately call Vanessa to report the miraculous recovery. The offshore broker would freeze the wire transfer, and Vanessa would lock Colin in a psychiatric ward permanently. Our meticulously crafted legal trap would shatter before the bait was even set. I had to stop the enforcer from entering that bedroom, but I was a 65-year-old accountant. I possessed absolutely no physical ability to fight a man twice my size and half my age. I had to rely entirely on the element of absolute surprise. The enforcer took 2 heavy steps toward the hallway. His broad back was completely turned to me. He was totally focused on the doorway of the bedroom, assuming I was just a harmless old fool cowering by the stove. I looked down at the heavy cast-iron skillet resting on the front burner. I had used that exact pan for 20 years to cook Sunday breakfasts for my family. Now it was the only weapon available to save my son. I wrapped my trembling fingers tightly around the thick metal handle. The iron felt incredibly cold and heavy in my grip. I lifted it silently from the grate. I took 1 slow step forward. My worn loafers made absolutely no sound against the tiled floor. I raised the heavy skillet high above my right shoulder. The enforcer paused at the edge of the hallway, shifting his weight to adjust the bowl of poisoned food. I stepped directly behind him, swung my arm forward, and brought the cast-iron pan down with every single ounce of strength I had left in my old bones. The heavy metal connected squarely with the back of his shaved head. A sickening hollow crack echoed violently through the kitchen. The enforcer did not scream. The sheer force of the impact instantly severed his consciousness. His massive body crumpled forward like a felled tree. He hit the hardwood floor with a tremendous thud, dropping the ceramic bowl. The oatmeal and crushed sedatives splattered across the polished wood, mixing with the shards of broken pottery. The massive man lay completely motionless on his stomach. His breathing was heavy and ragged, but he was entirely unresponsive. I stood over him, clutching the cast-iron skillet, my chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The adrenaline pumping through my veins made my hands shake so violently I almost dropped the pan. I had crossed a terrifying threshold. There was no going back to the role of the quiet, obedient servant. I had violently assaulted a man in my own kitchen, and the countdown to Thursday morning had just accelerated dramatically. I rushed to the kitchen drawer and grabbed several rolls of heavy-duty duct tape and a thick coil of nylon rope I kept for yard work. I knelt beside the unconscious mercenary. He was incredibly heavy. Moving his dead weight felt like trying to drag a boulder across the floor. I grabbed him by the collar of his dark gray shirt and pulled with all my might. My lower back screamed in protest, but I managed to drag him across the kitchen tiles and toward the basement door. I opened the heavy wooden door and carefully maneuvered his body down the dark wooden steps. He slid down the stairs, hitting each step with a dull thud until he reached the concrete floor at the bottom. I followed him down into the cold, damp air of the cellar. I dragged him toward a heavy steel support pole in the center of the room. I hoisted his upper body against the cold metal and systematically wrapped the nylon rope around his chest, pinning his arms tightly to his sides. I used the heavy-duty tape to secure his ankles together and wrapped several layers across his mouth to ensure he could not scream when he finally woke up. I checked the bindings twice, pulling them as tight as my aging hands would allow. I left him slumped against the pole, completely neutralized and hidden in the dark. I ran back up the wooden stairs, locking the basement door securely behind me. I sprinted back into the kitchen and frantically wiped the spilled oatmeal and broken ceramic off the floor using my dish towel. I scrubbed the hardwood until there was no trace of the violence. I leaned against the marble island, gasping for air. The immediate threat was eliminated, but a massive new problem had just been created. Vanessa expected this man to monitor us constantly. She would eventually notice his absence from the security cameras. When she called his phone and received no answer, her suspicion would instantly spike. She might decide to rush home again to check on her investment. I had just introduced a massive volatile variable into our carefully controlled strategy. I had to devise a completely flawless lie to explain why her highly paid specialist had suddenly vanished from the property. I looked up at the black dome of the security camera, knowing the red light would blink on at any second. The flashpoint had been ignited, and the final sequence of our silent war was now in unstoppable motion. Thursday morning arrived with a cold gray light filtering through the kitchen windows. I had not slept a single second during the night. I stood by the marble island, listening to the heavy silence of the house. Down in the dark basement, the hired mercenary remained completely neutralized and securely bound to the steel support pole. Inside the ground floor bedroom, my son was enduring the final brutal hours of his chemical withdrawal. His skin was pale and his breathing was shallow, but his mind was absolutely sharp. We had survived the night, but the ultimate test was rapidly approaching. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times. In exactly 3 hours, the senior bank manager would sit at my dining room table to execute the wire transfer. The air in the house felt incredibly thin and suffocating. Every ticking second brought us closer to either total salvation or complete destruction. I poured a cup of black coffee, my hands remarkably steady, despite the terrifying reality of what I had done and what I was about to do. Heavy footsteps echoed on the mahogany staircase. Vanessa was descending from the 2nd floor. She was dressed for absolute victory. She wore a tailored charcoal gray suit and expensive pearl earrings. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her face carried the supreme confidence of a woman who believed she had already won the war. She walked into the kitchen, radiating arrogance and cold authority. She did not even look in my direction. She walked straight to the espresso machine and began preparing her morning drink. Today was her grand finale. She was mere hours away from legally stealing $20 million and abandoning her paralyzed husband and his useless father. She hummed a quiet, cheerful melody under her breath. The sheer evil of her casual attitude made my stomach churn, but I forced my face into a mask of total submission. I hunched my shoulders and continued wiping the clean counter, playing the part of the defeated old man one last time. She took a sip of her espresso and looked down the hallway toward my sun-closed bedroom door. Her brow furrowed slightly as she noticed the absolute silence. The massive enforcer was nowhere to be seen. Her sharp eyes darted around the kitchen and then rested directly on me. She demanded to know where the physical therapist was. She asked why the large utility vehicle was no longer parked in the driveway. The tension in the room instantly skyrocketed to a dangerous level. This was the exact moment where our entire strategy could collapse. If she suspected foul play, she would immediately call the police and the bank manager to freeze the transaction. I took a slow breath and turned to face her, holding my dish towel in trembling hands. I looked at the floor, completely avoiding direct eye contact. I delivered the lie I had meticulously rehearsed the night before. I told her the specialist had woken up extremely early to begin the aggressive muscle rehabilitation. I kept my voice pathetic and shaking. I explained that my son had suffered severe involuntary spasms during the session, and the specialist realized he needed a highly specific, rigid brace to continue the therapy safely. I said the large man had driven to a specialized medical supply warehouse on the other side of the city to retrieve the custom equipment before the bank meeting. I added that he told me not to disturb my son under any circumstances while he was gone. Vanessa listened to my trembling explanation. Her ego completely blinded her to the truth. The lie perfectly aligned with her assumption that the mercenary was simply being brutal and efficient. She rolled her eyes and muttered a complaint about incompetent contractors taking too long. She accepted the deception without a single follow-up question. She turned her back to me and walked into the formal dining room carrying her expensive coffee. She opened her designer briefcase and began arranging her documents on the polished wooden table. She placed her heavy silver pen right next to the empty signature line. The stage was officially set for the final act. I watched her from the kitchen shadows, feeling the heavy weight of the manila envelope hidden under my mattress. She was completely relaxed, waiting for the bank manager to arrive and finalize her stolen fortune. She had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath her feet was already crumbling. The massive enforcer was tied up in the dark, and my son was awake and fully aware. I walked quietly back to the guest bedroom to retrieve the legal weapon Warren had forged. The final countdown had begun, and I was ready to hand her the exact instrument of her own demise. I walked back into the small guest bedroom and locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel the pulse in my throat. I knelt beside the narrow twin bed and slid my hand under the mattress. My fingers brushed against the rough texture of the manila envelope. I pulled it out and removed the 4 pages Warren had drafted. The paper felt incredibly heavy in my hands, as if it carried the entire weight of my family history. I found an old wooden clipboard on the plastic dresser and clipped the pages onto it. I placed a cheap blue ballpoint pen right next to the thick metal clip. This was the exact instrument of her destruction, disguised as a mundane medical chore. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the stale air of the cramped room. I had to bury my burning hatred and my racing adrenaline deep inside my chest. I had to become the pathetic, broken old man she expected to see. I hunched my shoulders forward, introduced a slight tremor into my hands, and unlocked the door. I walked slowly down the hallway toward the formal dining room. The heavy grandfather clock ticked loudly, echoing off the hardwood floors. Each swing of the brass pendulum felt like a hammer striking the final nails into her coffin. As I approached the wide archway of the dining room, I could see Vanessa sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. The morning sunlight poured through the large bay windows, illuminating her tailored charcoal gray suit. She looked like a corporate executive preparing for a massive acquisition. She had arranged several glossy folders perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. These were the finalized bank documents for the $20 million wire transfer. She was holding a heavy silver fountain pen, spinning it casually between her manicured fingers. She was staring out the window with a small, satisfied smile on her face. She was entirely lost in her grand fantasy of Mediterranean villas and untraceable wealth. She was so consumed by her impending victory that she did not even hear my worn loafers shuffling into the room. I stopped a few feet away from the table. I deliberately cleared my throat, making it sound dry and weak. Vanessa snapped her head toward me. Her satisfied smile vanished instantly, replaced by a deep scowl of pure disgust. She let out a loud, exasperated sigh, as if my mere physical existence in her line of sight was an intolerable burden. She demanded to know what I wanted, warning me that the senior bank manager would be arriving in less than an hour, and she needed absolute silence. I lowered my eyes to the polished floor, completely avoiding her intense gaze. I extended my trembling hands forward, offering the wooden clipboard toward her. My voice shook with manufactured fear as I delivered the final critical lie. I told her the physical therapist had left this paperwork on the kitchen counter before he rushed out to get the specialized brace. I stammered, intentionally stumbling over my words. I explained that the specialist had explicitly stated he could not proceed with the aggressive muscle treatments or administer the heavy sedatives without her official signature on his liability waiver. I kept my head bowed, waiting for the inevitable explosion of her temper. Vanessa slammed her hands onto the table. The glossy folders jumped slightly. She berated me loudly, calling me an incompetent fool for interrupting her final preparations with trivial medical bureaucracy. She snatched the wooden clipboard out of my shaking hands with such violent force that the cheap blue pen clattered onto the floor. My chest tightened to the point of absolute pain. I slowly bent down to retrieve the dropped pen, keeping my eyes fixed on her hands. Vanessa did not read the dense legal text. She did not look at the second or third page. She simply glanced at the bold title printed at the top of the first page. She saw the words, "Comprehensive Waiver of Liability and Experimental Muscle Rehabilitation." Her eyes scanned the first paragraph, catching the specific mention, one of heavy sedatives, just as Warren had predicted. Her supreme arrogance completely blinded her to the trap. She viewed the medical care of her paralyzed husband not as a tragic reality, but as a repulsive, annoying chore that she delegated to hired help. She wanted this problem out of her face immediately, so she could return to her fantasy of immense wealth. She scoffed loudly, declaring that the physical therapist was an overly dramatic contractor who wasted too much time on pointless paperwork. She did not even bother to use the cheap blue pen I had picked up from the floor. She gripped her own expensive silver fountain pen. She flipped carelessly through the thick pages, ignoring the complex paragraphs where the document seamlessly transitioned from a medical waiver into a massive corporate restructuring agreement. She ignored the explicit clause permanently dissolving her primary trust. She completely ignored the final section transferring all intellectual property and real estate equity directly to me. She only saw the blank signature line at the very bottom of the fourth page. She pressed the silver nib of her pen against the thick paper. The sharp scratching sound of the ink flowing onto the page was the loudest noise I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of a tyrant signing her own absolute surrender. She wrote her name with aggressive, sweeping strokes, completely sealing her own legal and financial doom. She did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She violently pulled the signed pages out from under the metal clip and threw them across the table toward me. The papers slid across the polished mahogany and stopped right at the edge. She pointed a manicured finger toward the hallway. She ordered me to take the garbage paperwork, give it to the physical therapist the moment he returned, and then lock myself in my room until the bank meeting was completely over. She warned me that if I ruined her morning with any more stupid interruptions, she would personally ensure my son was moved to a state facility by tomorrow. I did not argue. I did not say a single word. I gathered the signed pages with shaking hands, completely overwhelmed by the monumental victory I held in my grasp. I bowed my head slightly, turned my back to her, and walked out of the dining room. I moved carefully down the hallway, clutching the dissolved trust agreement tightly against my chest. The bait had been taken. The trap was irrevocably sprung. I locked myself inside the small guest bedroom, pulled out my cellular phone, and dialed Warren. I spoke in a quiet, steady whisper. I told him we had the signature. The $20 million no longer belonged to her. Exactly at 10 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on the front door slammed 3 times. The sound reverberated through the quiet house like a judge striking a wooden gavel. Outside the window, I could see a sleek black town car idling in the driveway, parked directly behind Vanessa's luxury vehicle. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the kitchen hallway, clutching the edge of the cold marble counter. Vanessa practically floated out of the formal dining room. She had smoothed away every trace of her earlier rage, replacing it with an expression of profound, manufactured sorrow. She opened the heavy oak door to welcome her guests. The offshore broker stepped inside first. He wore the exact same tailored navy suit I had seen at the marina, carrying his thick leather briefcase with a practiced, arrogant ease. Right behind him stood the senior bank manager. He was an older, distinguished man with silver hair, wearing a conservative gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He carried an air of absolute institutional authority, holding a secure digital tablet tightly against his chest. They spoke in hushed, respectful tones, treating my home like a grieving funeral parlor. Vanessa played the perfect host, guiding them slowly into the dining room, where the morning sun illuminated the polished mahogany table. I crept closer, hiding behind the wide archway. The 3 of them took their seats at the heavy wooden table. The bank manager sat directly across from Vanessa, placing his secure tablet gently onto the wood. The offshore broker sat to her right, acting as her trusted financial advisor. The bank manager offered his deepest condolences regarding the tragic, deteriorating condition of her husband. He spoke with genuine sympathy, completely unaware that he was participating in a massive criminal conspiracy. He stated that transferring $20 million out of a domestic medical trust and into an international holding company was a monumental financial event. He explained that strict federal banking regulations required his physical presence today. He needed to verify her identity face-to-face, to witness her physical signature on the final authorization forms, and to confirm her explicit verbal consent before releasing the massive funds. Vanessa nodded slowly, dabbing the corner of her perfectly dry eye with a white tissue. She told him that she completely understood the rigid protocols and appreciated his personal attention to the delicate matter. She claimed that the heavy burden of managing the complex estate had become entirely too much for her to bear alone. Her theatrical performance was absolutely nauseating in its flawless execution. She leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the table, her voice trembling with artificial exhaustion. She spun a tragic, heartbreaking narrative for the bank manager. She told him that my son was losing his battle, and that his violent, unpredictable muscle spasms required a level of round-the-clock medical care that was draining her soul. She boldly claimed that liquidating the tech patents and pulling the equity from the house was the only way to secure the massive amount of liquid capital required to move him to a highly specialized experimental facility in Switzerland. She painted herself as a devoted, desperate wife making the ultimate financial sacrifice for the man she loved. She even mentioned me, stating that I was suffering from severe early-onset dementia, and that part of the money would be used to place me in a comfortable, secure home where I could no longer hurt myself. Every single word falling from her mouth was a calculated, venomous lie designed to make the bank manager rush the paperwork out of sheer human sympathy. The offshore broker nodded solemnly, playing his part perfectly as the supportive advisor. The bank manager sighed deeply, clearly moved by her tragic story. He unlocked his secure digital tablet and pulled a thick, glossy folder of official banking documents from his briefcase. He spread the heavy papers across the mahogany table, lining them up with precise mechanical movements. He explained that the offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands were completely verified and ready to receive the massive wire transfer. He pointed to the primary authorization form resting in the center of the table. He stated that once her physical signature was applied to the document, and he inputted his senior override codes into the banking system, the $20 million would instantly leave the domestic family trust. He warned her clearly and sternly that once the money crossed international lines, the transfer was completely irrevocable. The funds would instantly disperse into the 6 anonymous shell companies. He looked her directly in the eyes, asking her one final time if she was absolutely certain she wanted to completely liquidate the trust. Vanessa did not hesitate for a single second. She let out a long, trembling breath, projecting the image of a woman making a brave, difficult choice. She picked up her heavy silver fountain pen. The offshore broker leaned forward slightly, his eyes completely locked on the glossy banking documents, his immense greed radiating from his pores. Vanessa signed her name aggressively on the bottom line of the authorization form. She pushed the paperwork across the polished mahogany table directly toward the bank manager. The manager picked up the signed document, inspecting the signature closely to ensure it matched his strict institutional records. He nodded in complete satisfaction. He turned his attention to the glowing screen of his secure digital tablet. He typed in his complex administrative credentials and navigated directly to the primary trust dashboard. He placed his finger over the final execution button, preparing to transmit the $20 million across the ocean. I stood in the dark hallway, gripping the wall, waiting for the digital system to collide violently with the physical reality. The senior bank manager tapped his finger firmly against the glowing screen of his secure digital tablet. He leaned back in his heavy wooden chair and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He announced in a calm, professional tone that the financial authorization was officially submitted to the central routing server. The offshore broker let out a long, satisfied breath. He closed his thick leather briefcase with a loud metallic click and smiled directly at Vanessa. Vanessa returned the smile with absolute glowing confidence. Her posture was completely relaxed. She reached for her expensive porcelain coffee cup, taking a slow, delicate sip. She looked entirely victorious. She was already mentally spending the $20 million on foreign real estate and designer luxury goods. I remained frozen in the deep shadows of the hallway, clutching the edge of the wall so tightly my joints ached. My lungs burned because I was holding my breath, entirely terrified to make a single sound. I watched the digital progress bar on the manager tablet through the narrow crack in the archway. The bright green line moved steadily across the screen, representing the massive fortune slipping away from my family forever. The room was absolutely silent, except for the rhythmic, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock. Every swing of the brass pendulum felt like a physical blow to my chest. The bank manager nodded slowly, whispering that the international clearance system was currently verifying the receiving accounts in the Cayman Islands. He said it would only take another 30 seconds for the final digital handshake to complete. Vanessa practically vibrated with eager anticipation. Then the steady green progress bar abruptly halted. The screen of the secure digital tablet flashed a bright, vibrant red. A sharp, jarring error tone echoed loudly through the quiet dining room. It was 3 short, aggressive beeps that completely shattered the peaceful atmosphere. The bank manager frowned deeply. He leaned forward, bringing his face much closer to the screen. He tapped the glass multiple times, his thick fingers moving rapidly across the digital keyboard. Vanessa lowered her coffee cup instantly. Her relaxed smile vanished, replaced by a sharp look of profound irritation. She asked him in a tight, condescending voice if he had entered the routing numbers incorrectly. She reminded him severely that she did not have time for technical incompetence and demanded he fix it immediately. The bank manager did not immediately respond to her insult. He was staring intensely at the glowing red text. He muttered under his breath that the server connection was completely stable. He explained that this was not a simple routing error or a temporary network glitch. The central banking system had intentionally triggered an absolute hard stop on the transaction. The offshore broker shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He leaned over the polished mahogany table, trying to get a better view of the tablet. The effortless confidence that had defined him at the marina was suddenly evaporating. He asked the manager nervously if the federal authorities had flagged the destination accounts for suspicious activity. The bank manager shook his head slowly. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his suit pocket and wiped a sudden layer of cold sweat from his forehead. He cleared his throat, his voice entirely stripped of its earlier comforting tone. He stated that the destination accounts were completely clear. The problem was not the receiving end of the transaction. The catastrophic failure was originating entirely from the domestic side of the ledger. Vanessa slammed her manicured hands onto the table, causing her coffee cup to rattle violently against its saucer. She demanded that he bypass the error immediately and force the wire transfer through the system. She raised her voice, projecting the terrifying, absolute authority she usually reserved for me. She told him she was the primary legal guardian, and she had explicitly authorized the release of the funds. The bank manager looked up from his tablet. His eyes were wide and filled with complete professional bewilderment. He looked at Vanessa not as a grieving widow, but as a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. He told her he could not force the transfer because the system was rejecting her credentials entirely. He stated that her digital biometric profile and her physical signature no longer held any legal authority over the family estate. Vanessa stood up so quickly, her heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. She screamed at him, calling him a liar and a completely incompetent idiot. She pointed directly at the glossy banking documents resting on the table. She yelled that she held the absolute medical power of attorney and the strict court-ordered guardianship. She claimed nobody else on the planet had the legal right to touch the money. The bank manager raised his hands in a defensive gesture, trying to calm her down. He told her to lower her voice and listen to him carefully. He read directly from the glaring red text on his screen. He announced that according to the Central Banking Registry, the primary medical trust she was attempting to liquidate did not exist anymore. He explained that the entire legal entity had been permanently and irrevocably dissolved exactly 35 minutes ago. Vanessa froze completely. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a pale, lifeless ghost. She stared at the bank manager, her mouth slightly open, unable to form a single coherent word. The offshore broker jumped up from his seat. He demanded to know how a massive multi-million-dollar trust could be dissolved without the primary guardian initiating the action. The bank manager tapped the screen one final time, accessing the deepest level of the administrative banking logs. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly into Vanessa's eyes. He spoke with the cold, absolute finality of a professional who was terminating a business relationship. He explained that the dissolution was initiated by a highly complex corporate restructuring agreement. He stated that this agreement was legally executed, signed, and digitally submitted to the banking network by Vanessa herself just moments ago. He read the exact timestamp of the submission aloud. It matched perfectly with the exact minute she had aggressively signed the fake medical liability waiver I had handed her on the wooden clipboard. He explained the brutal, inescapable reality of her situation. By signing that specific document, she had legally surrendered her medical power of attorney, she had willingly relinquished her guardianship, and she had authorized the immediate transfer of all tech patents and real estate equity into a newly formed blind trust. He looked at the glowing screen and delivered the final fatal blow. He told her that the new blind trust was controlled solely and exclusively by her father-in-law. He placed his tablet back into his leather briefcase, snapping it shut. He stated clearly that her name was no longer attached to a single dollar in their entire system. The holding account she was attempting to wire to the Cayman Islands currently contained an absolute balance of zero. The silence that descended upon the dining room was absolute and terrifying. It was not the peaceful quiet of a calm morning. It was the suffocating silence of a massive, catastrophic collapse. The offshore broker realized instantly that the entire operation was completely dead. He had spent weeks setting up international shell companies for a client who was now entirely bankrupt and legally exposed. He looked at Vanessa with pure, unadulterated disgust. He grabbed his heavy leather briefcase and backed away from the mahogany table. He did not say goodbye or offer a single word of support. He simply turned around and walked rapidly toward the front door, desperate to distance himself from the massive legal fallout that was clearly impending. The bank manager stood up slowly, straightening his conservative gray suit jacket. He looked at Vanessa with a mixture of professional pity and extreme detachment. He told her there was absolutely nothing more he could do for her today. He suggested she contact a very good defense lawyer immediately. He picked up his glossy folders, leaving the worthless signature authorization on the table. He walked out of the room, his hard leather shoes clicking firmly against the floorboards. The front door opened and closed heavily behind him. Vanessa was left standing completely alone in the center of the grand dining room. Her manicured hands were shaking violently. Her perfect charcoal gray suit suddenly looked entirely out of place on a woman who had just lost her entire world. She looked down at the polished mahogany table, staring blankly at the silver fountain pen she had used to sign away her stolen empire. Her supreme arrogance had been the exact weapon used to destroy her. She had been so incredibly impatient, so eager to finalize her theft, and so completely dismissive of my existence that she had willingly signed a legal contract transferring $20 million directly out of her own hands. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the hallway and walked slowly into the bright sunlight of the dining room. I did not hunch my shoulders. I did not tremble in fear. I stood perfectly upright. I looked at the woman who had poisoned my son and tortured me for 2 brutal years. The psychological camouflage was finally stripped away. The system rejection was not a glitch. It was the ultimate flawlessly executed adjustment. The heavy front door clicked shut, sealing us inside the quiet house. Vanessa stood completely still at the head of the polished mahogany table. For a long moment, she did not move or speak. She simply stared at the empty space where the bank manager had just been sitting. Then her shoulders began to tremble. It was not the trembling of a woman holding back tears, but the violent vibration of absolute, unadulterated rage. She slowly turned her head to look at me standing in the bright sunlight of the dining room. The flawless mask of the grieving, exhausted wife shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Her beautiful face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure hatred. Her eyes widened and her jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might crack. She took one slow step toward me and then another. Her high heels struck the hardwood floor like the sharp crack of a whip. She did not ask how I had managed to dissolve the trust. Her supreme arrogance simply could not process the fact that I had completely outsmarted her. Instead, she assumed I had somehow stumbled into a bureaucratic loophole or accidentally filed a competing grievance that temporarily froze the accounts. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest. Her voice started as a low, dangerous hiss and quickly escalated into a piercing scream. She called me a pathetic, meddling old fool. She yelled that I had just ruined my only chance to live out my remaining years in a comfortable bed. She closed the distance between us, invading my personal space, her face inches from mine. I could smell the expensive perfume and the stale espresso on her breath. She venomously declared that she was still the absolute master of this house. She was completely trapped in her own delusion, entirely forgetting the exact terms of the document she had signed just an hour ago. She threatened me with immediate destitution. She promised to pack my few miserable belongings into garbage bags and throw them onto the front lawn before the sun went down. She swore she would call the local authorities and have me forcibly removed for trespassing on her property. Her rage then shifted toward my son. She used his absolute vulnerability as her ultimate weapon against me. She stated with cold, absolute cruelty that because I had dared to interfere with her financial plans, my son would pay the ultimate physical price. She promised to cancel his private medical insurance immediately. She swore she would have him transferred out of his comfortable ground-floor bedroom and dumped into the most underfunded, neglected state-run psychiatric ward in the county. She described in horrific detail how he would spend the rest of his miserable life staring at a concrete wall, completely alone and forgotten. She took a deep breath, feeding off her own toxic energy, convinced she had terrorized me back into submission. She pointed toward the hallway leading to my small guest room. She ordered me to start packing my bags right this second. She screamed that the game was entirely over and that she would call her lawyers to completely undo whatever pathetic clerical error I had caused. She demanded absolute obedience, assuming I was terrified of her threats. She waited for me to drop my gaze to apologize and to beg for her mercy, just as I had done every single day for the past 2 years. But I did not look away, and I did not lower my head. I walked slowly toward the head of the polished mahogany table. Vanessa was breathing heavily. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps. She looked at me with a mixture of absolute confusion and rising terror. She could not comprehend how the broken old man she had tortured for 2 years was suddenly standing before her with perfect posture and calm authority. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or insult her the way she had just insulted me. I reached into the inside pocket of my worn cardigan and pulled out the small, encrypted flash drive. I placed it gently onto the wooden surface right next to her expensive silver fountain pen. I told her the silent adjustment was officially over. I told her I knew absolutely everything. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a thick stack of folded papers. These were the hard physical copies I had printed at the local library. I unfolded the first document and slid it across the table toward her. It was the secondary mortgage she had secretly taken out against my colonial home. Her eyes darted down to the paper, and the last remaining color drained entirely from her face. She saw the perfect forgery of my signature at the bottom of the page. I kept my voice incredibly cold and steady. I explained that I had spent 30 years of my life working as a senior forensic accountant hunting financial criminals. I told her I had easily bypassed her pathetic laptop security and found the hidden ledgers. I spoke the exact dollar amount she had lost in the unregulated cryptocurrency markets. I watched her swallow hard as I detailed the aggressive private lenders who were currently hunting her for the money she had stolen. I made it absolutely clear that she was completely underwater and that the $20 million she tried to steal today was her desperate, panicked bailout. I did not give her a single second to formulate a lie. I placed the second piece of evidence on top of the forged mortgage. It was a printed photograph I had taken the previous night. The image clearly showed the black duffel bag belonging to her hired mercenary unzipped to reveal the massive bottles of heavy chemical sedatives. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her I knew she had been systematically poisoning my son for 2 entire years. I told her I knew his spinal cord had partially healed and that she had kept him trapped in a chemically induced nightmare just to maintain her ironclad legal control over his estate. I watched her hands begin to shake violently. The realization that I knew about the deliberate drugging completely destroyed her defensive posture. She knew this was no longer just a financial dispute. This was attempted manslaughter, and I had the physical proof sitting right in front of her. Finally, I pulled out the original copy of the document she had signed less than an hour ago. I laid the 4 pages of the corporate restructuring agreement out side by side on the mahogany table. I pointed to the dense legal paragraphs hidden on the 2nd and 3rd pages. I read the exact legal clauses aloud to her. I forced her to listen to the irrefutable fact that she had willingly and permanently dissolved her own primary trust. I pointed to her fresh ink signature at the bottom of the 4th page. I told her that she had been so incredibly eager to rid herself of the annoying medical chore of caring for her husband that she had legally transferred every single intellectual property right and every single penny of real estate equity directly into a blind trust controlled exclusively by me. I told her the bank manager had not made a mistake. She had simply surrendered her entire empire because she was too arrogant to read the fine print. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her defeat. But I was not finished. I delivered the final devastating blow with absolute clinical precision. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of the table. I told her that my lawyer had not just drafted the new trust agreement. I explained that early this morning my lawyer had also forwarded the entire dossier of her financial crimes, the forged mortgage documents, and the details of the Cayman Islands shell company directly to the federal authorities. I told her the international holding account she had tried to fund was currently flagged for massive wire fraud. I stated clearly that the federal investigators were already monitoring her digital footprints, and that the aggressive private lenders she owed money to would be knocking on this door very soon. I stood up straight, looking down at her broken, trembling figure. I told her she had absolutely nothing left. She had no money, she had no house, she had no legal power, and she had nowhere to run. Vanessa stared at this document scattered across the mahogany table. She shook her head rapidly, refusing to accept the reality of her total defeat. She looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes and let out a harsh, venomous laugh. She claimed my physical evidence was completely worthless. She said it was merely the word of a senile old man against the word of a highly devoted wife. She spat out that I had no reliable witnesses to ever corroborate my insane story. She reminded me with absolute cruelty that her husband was a brain-dead vegetable who could not testify in any court on earth. She placed her hands firmly on the table, preparing to launch into another screaming tirade to forcefully regain her dominance. But before she could speak a single word, the heavy rhythmic sound of bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor echoed from the dark hallway. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and completely unnatural for a house that was supposed to be completely empty. Vanessa froze completely. Her head snapped toward the wide archway of the dining room. I stepped back, allowing the bright morning sunlight to illuminate the doorway. Colin stepped into the room. He was not slumped in a synthetic leather wheelchair. He was not slurring his words or staring blankly at the wooden floorboards. He was standing perfectly upright, his broad shoulders pulled back, his posture radiating absolute physical strength. The pale, sweat-soaked skin of his severe chemical withdrawal had vanished entirely. His eyes were completely clear, sharp, and focused with terrifying intensity directly on his wife. The sheer impossibility of his physical presence struck Vanessa like a physical blow to her chest. Her knees buckled violently beneath her. She collapsed heavily back into her wooden dining chair, knocking her expensive porcelain coffee cup onto the floor. The cup shattered loudly, but she did not even blink. She was completely paralyzed by the conscious man standing right in front of her. Colin walked slowly around the edge of the polished mahogany table, stopping just a few feet away from her trembling figure. When he finally spoke, his voice was incredibly deep, resonant, and completely devoid of the weak, raspy tone she had grown accustomed to over the last 2 brutal years. He did not yell. His quiet, calm delivery was far more terrifying than any frantic scream could ever be. He told her he had heard every single venomous word. He said he had felt the bitter taste of every crushed pill she forced down his throat, and he had remembered every single vicious insult she hurled at his father. He verbally dismantled her entire character piece by piece. He told her she was never a sophisticated criminal mastermind, but just a greedy, pathetic parasite who fed on the absolute vulnerability of her own family. He explained how her supreme arrogance had blinded her to the simplest truth of all. She believed she was an untouchable ruler operating in complete secrecy, but she was merely a careless warden who had completely failed to notice that her prisoners were wide awake and holding the keys. Vanessa pressed her trembling hands against her mouth. Tears of absolute terror finally spilling over her pale cheeks. She tried to softly whisper his name to form some pathetic excuse or plea for mercy, but he immediately raised his hand, silencing her completely. He told her she no longer possessed the right to speak to him or even look at him. He delivered the final consequences of her horrific actions with absolute clinical precision. He announced that he was filing for an immediate legal annulment of their marriage based on severe physical abuse and calculated financial fraud. He stated clearly that she would walk out of this house with nothing but the expensive suit on her back. He looked down at her shaking hands and delivered the ultimate killing blow. He told her that the local police were currently driving toward the house with a signed warrant for her immediate arrest on charges of attempted manslaughter. He stepped back from the table, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. He looked at the broken, weeping woman who had tried to bury him alive and declared that her miserable reign of terror was permanently finished. The offshore broker had practically sprinted down the driveway before Colin even finished his sentence. I heard the engine of his luxury town car roar to life, and the tires squeal violently against the asphalt as he abandoned his bankrupt client. Vanessa remained slumped in her wooden dining chair. Her face was buried in her trembling hands. She was completely broken. The grand illusion of her superiority had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified criminal waiting for the inevitable end. The heavy silence of the dining room was suddenly broken by the wailing sound of approaching sirens. The noise grew louder and more piercing, cutting through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed brightly against the large bay windows, illuminating the polished mahogany table with a frantic, chaotic glow. Warren had kept his promise. He had coordinated perfectly with the local authorities, anticipating the exact moment the legal trap would spring. Heavy fists pounded against the front door. I walked past Vanessa without giving her a single glance and turned the brass deadbolt. 4 uniformed police officers rushed into the hallway, accompanied by a plainclothes detective. They moved with swift professional purpose. Vanessa immediately tried to play her final desperate card. She threw herself onto the hardwood floor, weeping hysterically. She pointed her manicured finger at me and screamed that I was a violent lunatic who had hijacked her husband and her home. She begged the officers to arrest me. The detective did not even look at her. He walked directly toward the dining room and saw Colin standing perfectly upright. Colin calmly introduced himself and stated clearly that he was the primary victim of severe domestic abuse and systematic chemical poisoning. He pointed to the digital evidence and the forged mortgage documents resting on the table. He told the detective that his wife was attempting a massive international wire fraud. The detective nodded and signaled to the uniformed officers. 2 of them hauled Vanessa up from the floor. She kicked and screamed, her expensive charcoal gray suit completely ruined by her pathetic struggle. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around her wrists echoed through the house. It was the absolute sound of ultimate justice. As they dragged her toward the front door, I stopped the detective. I handed him the basement key and told him there was one more piece of garbage that needed to be removed from my property. I explained that her hired mercenary was currently secured to a steel support pole downstairs, along with his heavy duffel bag full of illegal sedatives. The detective called for backup and rushed down the wooden steps. A few minutes later, the massive enforcer was hauled up the stairs, struggling against the heavy nylon rope and duct tape. He was shoved into the back of a second patrol car. The flashing lights pulled away from the curb, taking the poison out of our lives forever. The heavy oak door closed one final time, leaving my son and me standing in the quiet safety of our reclaimed home. The following morning arrived with a profound, beautiful stillness. The suffocating tension that had poisoned this house for 2 brutal years was completely gone. The air felt incredibly light and breathable. I woke up in my own spacious master bedroom, having moved my belongings out of the cramped guest quarters the night before. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of black coffee. The marble countertops were perfectly clean, and the house was entirely peaceful. I poured 2 steaming mugs and walked out through the back door onto the wooden patio. The early morning sun was just beginning to rise over the dense pine trees, casting a warm golden light across the sprawling green lawn. Colin was already sitting in a comfortable wicker chair. He was wearing a simple cotton sweater and looking out at the property we had fought so hard to protect. His posture was relaxed, and the remaining tremors from the brutal chemical withdrawal had completely subsided. I handed him a warm ceramic mug and sat down in the chair next to him. We did not need to exchange a flood of emotional words. We simply sat in the quiet comfort of our shared victory. We watched a pair of bluebirds land on the wooden fence, entirely unbothered by the violence and deception that had occurred inside the walls of the house. We had survived the ultimate betrayal by remaining completely silent and calculating. We had learned a brutal but necessary lesson about the nature of family and the absolute necessity of firm boundaries. True respect is never given freely by those who seek to exploit you. It must be demanded, and sometimes it must be forcefully extracted through the strict application of truth and consequence. We had reclaimed our dignity not through screaming matches or physical destruction, but through a meticulous adjustment of reality. We let the arrogant destroy themselves with their own unchecked greed. The federal authorities had officially frozen the fraudulent offshore accounts. Warren was successfully navigating the complex annulment and ensuring the aggressive private lenders directed their massive lawsuits entirely at Vanessa in her locked prison cell. The highly lucrative tech patents were completely secure, and the generational home belonged solely to us once again. My son took a slow, deep sip of his coffee. He looked at me with a genuine, peaceful smile and thanked me for never giving up on him. I rested my hand on his shoulder, feeling the strong, capable muscles beneath his shirt. The silent war was permanently over, and the rest of our lives belonged entirely to us. The greatest lesson drawn from this ordeal is that true power does not reside in loud threats, arrogant displays, or physical intimidation. It thrives in calculated silence and unwavering patience. We often mistake cruelty for absolute strength and humility for pathetic weakness. Yet when pushed to the absolute brink, it is the quiet, methodical application of intellect and truth that systematically dismantles tyranny. We learned that family is never an unconditional shield for abuse, and establishing impenetrable boundaries is an act of profound self-respect. Evil is ultimately destroyed not by its victim's vengeance, but by its own blinding arrogance. If you have ever had to reclaim your dignity from those who fatally underestimated your silent strength, share your survival story in the comments below, and subscribe for more tales of ultimate justice.